Once again, this is Otherworldly Fundraising. Our fundraising efforts are benefiting one simple wish. Links are located in the description below.
Hi, Victoria. How you doing tonight? Or this evening, actually, where you're at.
I'm just unmuting myself. I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Doing fine, ma'am. I just want to say thank you for joining us, and it's an honor to get an opportunity to speak with you. I'm looking forward to talking with you, and especially about your dad. Before we get started, I just want to say to the folks out there that are watching, remember, part of the reason we're doing this is to raise money for the One Simple Wish Foundation. It's a great charity that helps to bring wishes to children that are in foster care. A lot of these kids have gone through childhood trauma. They've seen a lot of things that would break most adults. And the name says it all. These kids are not asking for a lot. They're asking for very simple things that a lot of kids and even adults take for granted. So if the spirit moves you, please, by all means, donate during this next hour. And if you can't donate today, bring your wallets tomorrow, because we're going to be doing this again with a lot of other fine folks, like the lady I'm talking to right now, Miss Victoria Price. Victoria is an established author, speaker, and teacher. But the reason why I'm excited to talk about her is she is also the daughter of my all-time favorite actor, Mr. Vincent Price. I grew up on your dad's movies, and like I said, he's one of my boyhood heroes. I mean, he was just really amazing. I wanted to ask you, being the daughter of Vincent Price, when did you realize that this wasn't just dad? When did you realize that this was a horror icon and a celebrated actor?
You know, I grew up in Los Angeles and Hollywood. So I think in some way, you know, it was like maybe growing up in Detroit and you kind of like everybody's in the car industry in some way, right? It was a company town. And so there were a lot of other kids in my class in school whose parents were in the movie business. So it wasn't so much that he was in the movie business that seemed special or made him seem special. It was really just who he was that made him seem special to me, you know, and I thought that that's really how other people reacted to him too. He just was this big, bright light, and he always retained that childlike joy and enthusiasm for trying new things and meeting people and kind of trying and doing anything. And so that was, to me, what made him seem so different from other adults. So it wasn't really, I mean, yes, of course, I recognized that people came up to him and asked him for his autograph and recognized him and all of those things. But it's really how he moved through the world to me that made him seem so different than most adults.
Gotcha. I wanted to ask, was there a particular role of your dad's that was a favorite of yours?
Well, I don't like horror movies. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I've never liked being scared, you know? So even as a little kid, the first thing they took me to see that he was in was Peter Pan, a production of Peter Pan in Los Angeles. And I was so terrified of the fact, well, first of all, I didn't understand what had happened to his hand, why he had a hook. And then he was so mean and he was doing bad things to all those kids on stage. And that didn't seem like the person I knew at all. So after that, they pretty much, you know, I could watch him on television, but they knew horror movies were not going to be for me. And I just never really liked being scared. And so I knew he did horror movies, but I really knew about it from the things that he did that spoofed himself, like, let's say, The Muppet Show or Carol Burnett Show or things like that. So I knew, you know, that he made scary movies, but I didn't watch them. And now, of course, I've seen them and I realize they're not so scary compared to what's out there now. But at the time, you know, I know my friends all wanted to spend Halloween with us and things like that, but I didn't know that he was a scary person because he just was the least scary person on the planet.
Well, the fascinating thing about your dad is he really didn't become known as a horror actor until I think it was really House of Wax. Throughout the 40s, I remember him from our Christian has mentioned Laura and Song of Bernadette. I remember him from Dragonwyck, which I think is a very underrated movie. And
it is an underrated movie. And I think that movie, there was a great article in the New Yorker last week by Richard Brody about how Dragonwyck was Joe Mankiewicz's first film as a director. He produced other films, but it was his first film as a director. And it's a really wonderful article about how the seeds of all of Mankiewicz's future films can be found in Dragonwyck. And I would actually say the same thing is true of my dad, that the seeds of so many of the characters he became most famous for playing, but in particular, let's say all the Gothic Poe films, they're all found in Dragonwyck. He played many drug addicts over time. He played these elegant men whose lives fall apart, so it's all in there in Dragonwyck.
I was also going to say another favorite of mine is Leave Her to Heaven, which
Yes.
I'm a huge Gene Tierney fan, and I love the movies that your dad made with her.
Yeah, and Laura on top of that. Yeah.
Were there any actors or actresses that your dad knew that he was really close to, they really considered good friends?
Yeah, absolutely. Boris Karloff, was a dear friend of his. Close friends that he probably socialized with more. Eddie Albert was one of our dearest friends, who was a Broadway actor, and then of course people know him on TV from Green Acres. So he was one of those people who was always over a lot. But there were so many, when he was married to my stepmother, so many of the great British actors, he was so honored to call friends. He met John Gielgud when he was my dad was in his early 20s in London. My stepmother was dear friends with Alec Guinness and Sir Laurence Olivier and Maggie Smith and Judi Dench. And I know my dad was just so honored to call some of the greatest actors of this generation and the previous generation friends. And that was, he was a fan. He was a fan from the very beginning. He wrote fan letters in college. When he did, the first play he ever did was with Helen Hayes, who was the first lady of the American theater. And when he went out to Hollywood for the first time, she sent a letter of introduction to someone she considered a friend in Hollywood, who was Joan Crawford. I mean, there wasn't really a bigger star than Joan Crawford at certain point in Hollywood. And so my dad, got a call one day, and he picked up the phone, and she said, "Oh, Vincent, it's Joni." And my dad's like, "Joni, who?" And she invited him to over for a potluck, which was not at all what people from the Midwest, which is where my dad was from, thought of as a potluck. And she was constantly a kind, dear friend to him during his early years of Hollywood. So he had Roddy McDowell, another dear family friend. So he just was one of those people who made friends. He was not maybe on the level of Roddy. I think Roddy was one of those people there are people in life who have a gift for friendship, and Roddy was one of those people. He had a gift for friendship. My dad had a gift for connecting with people.
Well, I was going to say, I would have loved to have spent time with him, considering the fact that he was a gourmet cook, his love of art. He just really struck me as one of these Renaissance men. It was just anything that was creative. It just seemed like your dad just was able to do it. And
absolutely. Yeah, no, he was often called a Renaissance man. And I like to joke that that's what they call you if you're famous. And then, for the rest of us, it's really, you're a workaholic multitasker. So, but he just was somebody who, he always said, if you limit your interests, you limit your life. And if you're always curious, you'll never be bored. And that's how he lived. He just had this omnivorous appetite for life.
Well, I read the biography that you wrote about your dad. Wonderful book, by the way.
Thank you.
I remember one of the things that stood out was your dad was always constantly waiting for the next job, or was always constantly looking and waiting for the next job. And something you wrote kind of struck me, that he was always worried that this job he was doing was going to be his last job. And it's just hard to believe someone of that talent could have those kind of doubts about himself. And it just really made him seem so human, because it just seemed like a very humble person to feel that way.
Yeah, he was a very humble person. And I think he also recognized the power structure of the industry. To people who aren't in the industry, you think, well, the actors are the face of the industry. But, even as a little kid in the school that I went to, elementary school, I understood that the kids are the producers were, or the studio heads, let's say, were at the top of the heap, then the producers, then the directors, and after that, even though, nobody might know who those producers or directors were, if you were just Joe Schmo, the actors depended on others. And my dad really understood that. I think the other thing, two things to remember, and I've been thinking about this a lot because of the actor strike and the writer strike. In those days, there were no residuals. There were no residuals till the 1970s. And
Right.
so my dad made 105 movies and he didn't get a dime for any of them. All those movies, when they're shown on television, why do you think everybody has seen the blessing and the curse of it? The reason everybody has seen a Vincent Price movie, there was once, I think it was either a New Yorker or a New York Times, like little cartoon, and it said, somewhere, someplace in the universe, a Vincent Price movie is playing, because it's true. But the reason why is, they didn't owe all these levels of residuals. So even now, if somebody repackages House of Wax, his estate doesn't get a dime. And so there wasn't money coming in. You couldn't have a run of 6 good years on Friends and live off of that. There was nothing else coming in. So first of all, he saw it as a job, and a job that put money on the table. I think the second thing, though, is that he loved to work. He loved acting. He loved to work. If he wasn't acting, he was lecturing. 60 cities in 65 days every year all over America. He was the second most popular public speaker after Eleanor Roosevelt. He worked for Sears Roebuck, literally worked for them. He was $1 a year man for 15 years for the U.S. government, for something called the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, protecting and promoting the art of Native Americans. So he was not somebody who sat still very well. Yeah. And, but also it really, I think he came from a line of very successful entrepreneurs. And to him, that's what he was. He was an actor / it was a form of being an entrepreneur. He didn't go to a 9-to-5 job, and he wasn't going to get a watch and a severance, or some, retirement fund at the end. And so it was very important for him to keep working.
I did want to mention, you were talking about not getting residuals, like a 6-year run on Friends. What's interesting now is I am a huge fan of Swinguli on MeTV, and your dad's movies. I think he averages at least a Vincent Price movie once every couple of months. Not just him, but Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney. And I always find it wonderful that there are young kids that are being introduced to these films now. So,
absolutely, and that's the blessing of it. The blessing of it is that so many kids saw my dad growing up. I mean, Svengoolie is the second version of Svengoolie, the first Svengoolie, from all those horror hosts, Ghoulardi in Cleveland, all of them, every kid who watched those shows knew my dad and then found out more about him. And so that wouldn't have happened if he had been only able to be seen in the movie theater.
Christian had a very good question. I apologize for not getting to it sooner. Christian was wanting to ask about your dad's roles in films that were done for kids, or specials that were done for kids, like The Great Mouse Detective and Peter Cottontail.
Yeah, first of all, I guess what I should say is, when he became known as a horror actor, starting in the early 50s, and as it moved on, one of the things he realized really quickly was that the way to have longevity as an actor is to be introduced to each next generation of moviegoers, right? Because kids love going to the movies. Kids are learning about the world through movies. And so he had this whole legion of fans who were teenagers in the 50s who knew who he was, whereas many of his peers some of whom had been vastly more famous than he was in the 30s and 40s, were sort of fading from popularity and view. And so I was born in the early 60s. Now, my dad was in his 50s at this point. So all my friends, he thought, well, I don't want to be one of those old people, and I don't want her friends to not know who I am. So a lot of the TV shows that he did in the 60s were, in some ways like a way of connecting with my generation and my friends and my peers, but also he loved young people because young people are alive to the world. And to the very end of his life, he was always surrounded by young people. And it was so important to him. So of course, then to make things that young people would like, not just in the horror genre, but like The Great Mouse Detective, that was, he had this amazing voice. And his three siblings were very musical. And while my dad could sing, he really, I think his speaking voice was his instrument. And so to get to be in a Disney cartoon and have a singing role in a Disney cartoon was this incredible opportunity for him. And he loved doing it. And I think now people are recognizing, first of all, how important The Great Mouse Detective is in Disney's history, sort of the beginning of a whole other wave for them. But also, I think they're recognizing that it's an underrated Disney film, and it's becoming more and more popular, and he loved doing it. And same with all those specials, like the Christmas special. I mean, he could see that we were all my friends were watching The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, and there was Boris, playing the Grinch. And so he wanted to have the opportunity to do things like that kids would love and get to watch. Now, that Peter Cottontail is not The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, let's be real, but it's not Dr. Seuss either. So
well, that's true, but it's still enjoyable.
Yes.
It was a staple of my childhood. And I was going to say, where I grew up at, we didn't have a lot of kids in my neighborhood. Our nearest neighbors were maybe about a half mile away, and they were a married couple of my parents' age. They didn't have any children, so television was my companion as a kid. And almost every weekday there would be an episode of the Brady Bunch with your dad, or there'd be an episode of Batman as Egghead, or an episode of Duck Troop, which I do want to say Egghead on Batman was one of my favorite characters. And I love these shows because, again, I'm watching the movies on Saturday afternoons, A House of Wax or The Invisible Man, The Invisible Man Returns. But then I'm watching him doing these comedic roles and doing them just so fantastically. And
well, he loves comedy. I mean, he was a hilarious person. He was a very funny man. Yeah. And he did it so well on his social media, which, by the way, is Master of Menace on, all the appropriate social media things. I started it from scratch years ago, and, it's been a fun learning curve to learn about all the different things that are now part of social media. But I started doing reels fairly recently, and it's been fun. And I noticed that some of the iconic roles, of course, do really well, like House on Haunted Hill. But the other day I posted a reel of my dad. It's one of my favorites, and my dad on the Jack Benny Show. And it's had well over 1 million views in a week. And I love that. I love that people, first of all, love the comedy, but second of all, that people are watching the Jack Benny Show on, social media now. And I think that's it's really fun. It's fun to be able, because of my dad's appeal to all different generations, hopefully I can continue to share some of the things and some of the actors who were household names with, people who might not have heard of them because they're coming maybe through the horror genre, let's say.
Well, that's one of the wonderful things about digital television, like MeTV, Antenna TV, FETV. There's such a demand now for the older shows, and they're starting to find an all-new audience again.
I love that.
I always used William Shallard as an example, and Whit Bissell, that unless you'd seen the Star Trek episode they did together, a lot of people didn't know who they were. Yeah, these were like two working character actors that were constantly in everything.
Right.
And it's just wonderful that now, like your dad, they're getting an opportunity to be introduced to a whole new audience, and it's a wonderful thing to see. And again, it's programming. I think a lot of parents and a lot of grandparents say, I grew up on it, so it's safe for the kids to watch. It beats Jerry Springer in the afternoon. It's better for me to be watching something like that. So it's safe programming. We got another question here. This kind of leads into a segment I was going to ask about. Christian wants to know if you're a cook like your dad.
My parents would laugh at that. I am an incredibly finicky eater. I always was as a kid, which was incredibly irritating to them. As a little kid, my dad taught me how to make all kinds of things for breakfast, and breakfast is still my favorite meal. So as a little kid, we would make pancakes together, and he had this particular way of making scrambled eggs that I still make, and popovers and all sorts of delicious things. My mother was really the baker, and she wasn't about to, have the patience to show me all of those things. But at the end of his life, my dad really saw cooking as as an art, but something that you had to learn and practice. So he was a very dedicated cook. He was constantly practicing things, and he would get it in his head to try things. And some of them were, more fun than others. Like, I felt like we had ratatouille for like a year straight. I'm sure that's not true, but he was trying to perfect ratatouille. And honestly, I have a really dear friend who eats a lot of ratatouille, and I can't even be near it. That's enough of that. Then one time he decided to learn how to make the perfect creme brulee, and it was during a college break. And so he and I made a Pyrex pan of creme brulee every single day. I couldn't even fit in my clothes when I went back to college. So, but I didn't really have an interest in it until college. And my boyfriend and I, he wanted to learn how to make Chinese food. And so we would try all these different things. He had a wok, and he was trying all these different things. And that kind of kindled the interest for me in learning how to do something well. And at the end of my dad's life, he had learned he'd gone to Italy to study with Marcella Hazan, who was like the Julia Child of Italy. And he learned how to make risotto. And at the end of his life, it was really the only thing he could eat. And so he taught me how to make an incredible risotto, and he was exacting. Like, he would sit and watch over me to make sure I was doing it correctly. So I would have to say that I cook I don't eat out that much because I'm still a picky eater. I enjoy cooking for myself, but I'm lazy. Like, I don't have the interest in sort of this blending the science and the art that makes somebody a good chef. So, but I've known a lot of wonderful chefs, and I'm actually working on a writing project right now that it's really a big theme of it is food. And I find that the whole foodie culture and chef culture is something that's just in me, even though, like, I know a tremendous amount about it. I just never had the exactitude to want to excel in it. But what I enjoy making well.
I'm a lazy cook myself. If I can't make it in the crock pot, I usually don't make it. So.
Well, I think too, the hard part is if I live in a tiny home, but also there's just me. And so, if you make something, then you're eating it for, day. Like I have had baked a chicken the other day, and it's like lunch, dinner, chicken. So, I think that's part of it too. It's much more fun to experiment and cook if you're cooking for people who are going to eat it all up. So
that's true. That's very true. That's very true. Now, if you didn't get your dad's gifts for cooking, I understand you did get your dad's appreciation for art. In fact, as I understand, you're on the board of the Vincent Price Art Museum.
I'm just an emeritus member of the board at this point. I think it's an incredible. First of all, let me just give a big shout out to the Vincent Price Art Museum. My dad was the most important thing in the world to him was the visual arts. It gave his whole life direction and purpose. He wanted to be an artist. When he realized he couldn't be as great as he wanted to be, he became an art historian. And he was studying art history in London when someone dared him to try out for a play. He always had the secret desire to be an actor, but his passion were the visual arts. I think museums were his church and art was his religion, really. And I grew up with two incredibly visual parents. My mother was a designer. And so I've always been a visual learner. I've always been an incredibly visual person. And because it was their mutual passion, they were constantly sort of explaining the world to me in a way that came, they were very verbal people, and we all were big readers. And obviously, you know, my dad made movies, but it was the art. And it was his love of the art that made me want to learn more about it. And so my dad, in the early 1950s, maybe late 1940s, actually, there was a art teacher at a small 2-year college in Los Angeles who invited him out, and she was doing to just meet the students and stuff. And he went out and he loved what she was doing. She was bringing some of the great Mexican artists to the United States to meet her students. I mean, she was amazing. And so he developed this relationship with her. And then he was asked to give the graduation speech in the late 1950s there. And my mom came. And at this point, my dad was on the board of the LA County Art Museum, of the UCLA Arts Council, and he was actually the chair of that. And everybody was sort of asking, because they had an incredible art collection, if he was ever going to donate to their institutions. And my mom, who had grown up all over the world, she grew up in England and Wales and China and Canada. And she was one of those people who came to America and knew that the opportunities that she had here, she never would have had anywhere else. And so she looked around at all this sea of faces, all of whom clearly were first generation college students, and she hadn't gone to college. And she said, this is where we're giving the collection. So they started, and they gave the collection there, and over their lifetime gave countless pieces of art there. It used to be the Marion Vincent Price Art Museum. Now it's art gallery, I guess. And now it's the Vincent Price Art Museum. And it's at East Los Angeles College. And it's an incredible, incredible place. Not only do they have unbelievable exhibitions and exhibitions that really reflect the diversity of Los Angeles, and in particular, East Los Angeles, but it's a working collection. So students there learn how to conserve art and curate art. It's not art in the rarefied air. And so much of the art that my dad collected was from Mexico and Central America and South America, where many of the students are from. And there's a big Asian component in Monterey Park, where the school is. And my dad and my mom traveled all around Asia, my mom being raised in China, and bought art, a lot of which ended up there. So, you know, it was an incredible, incredible gift. And I began going there when I was a kid, and I saw what a difference it made. And I saw how privileged I was to get to go to all these museums and grow up in this house with art. So yeah, so I was an art history major, and I've owned art galleries, and I still work with gallerists doing their outreach out in the world. But it's a real passion for me. And you know, it's interesting because I think the gift of that connection between my dad and me was it became our safe place, our little language. We would go to museums together. He would send me places. If I saw something, one time I was on a train, I must have been maybe 21, and I was on a train, and I was looking at the stops. This is long before cell phones, and I sort of, the name rang a bell, and I thought, there's something here I need to see. So I just got off this train, and I saw this incredible piece of art that I'd studied, but it so blew me away that I just stared at it for an hour without moving. And then I wrote my dad a postcard, and he wrote me back, you know, I'm so mad that you saw this before me, but I knew he wasn't mad. It was this, you know, and then it became this thing. From then on, when he realized I loved it in my own way as much as he did, we worked on a book about art together. He would send me to see things, especially when he got ill that he could no longer see. We would compare notes. We would talk about it. We'd go to museums together. it was a real gift to have that connection with him. And so, you know, for me still, I think museums are this place where just they feel like all the best things about a sanctuary to me, you know. I don't want to use the word church because I think a lot of people have from their childhoods not a great, you know, association with church, but that sort of that like a temple, a place of safety. And I still go into a museum and I'm like, okay, everything's okay.
It's wonderful that you've got that association with museums and art with your dad, and I can imagine that's a wonderful way to still have a connection with him even after him being gone for so many years.
Yeah, and the fact that the museum, you know, there comes a time where, you know, the family should step aside and you know, the most important thing for me with the Vincent Price Art Museum is that what it stood for, what it meant to my parents continue on, and what they're doing is just phenomenal. And if any people are out there in LA or you're going to LA, please go check out the Vincent Price Art Museum. The collection there is extraordinary. The campus is extraordinary. I had the privilege of giving the graduation speech there last year, which was amazing to come full circle, 11,000 graduates. It was really incredible.
Amazing. Well, one of the things I admired about your dad, like I said, loved him as an actor, loved it. I loved his horror roles, but one of the things I really admired about him was the work that he did with Sears in bringing art to the public. I believe it was in your book that you mentioned that for the first time, people from the Midwest, people from the East Coast, people from the West Coast, people from every walk of life in America could have a unique piece of artwork in their home. And I really think he really brought that attention to people. It isn't just something that hangs in a museum. It's something that you can find, you can bring it to your home, you can share it with your children, you can pass it down. And I always thought that was a wonderful thing that he did for society as a whole. I think the connection with your dad, it's like, well, Vincent Price likes artwork, I gotta like it too. That's cool. But at the same time, too, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You felt art was transformative, and to have it in your home, to have a relationship with a work of art every single day, it's a reciprocal transformative experience. And he just felt it was so important that art not be the province of the elite, something that only the uber rich could own or the rest of us could see in museums. It's something, and so the idea was to have people be able to buy. He bought every piece of art that was sold in the Vincent Price collection himself. He found them. My mother framed most of them in our basement. She became this incredible, I mean, she designed the frames, and it was definitely a family affair. And I think for him, it was really about opening up art to the masses. He was a populist because he felt that art had transformed his life. He bought his first piece of art when he was 12 years old. He walked by a gallery and he saw something in the window, and it just blew his mind. And he went in, 12-year-old kid in St. Louis, Missouri, and he asked the gallery owner, there were like 3 galleries in St. Louis, and he asked the gallery owner what it was. And the man said, well, it's a first state Rembrandt etching. And my dad knew who Rembrandt was at 12 years old. And my dad just thought it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And this gallery owner, my dad asked how much it was, $37.50 in 1920, whatever, 3. And he made a payment plan with my dad. It took him 3 years to pay it off, but he owned a Rembrandt, a first state Rembrandt etching when he was 15 years old. And I bless that gallery owner. And I think that's what my dad wanted to recreate for everybody. So you could buy these on your Sears credit card on a payment plan. I met a woman one time who worked at Sears. I think it was maybe the second one. The first Vincent Price collection, they traveled to the different Sears. And the first one was, I believe, in Denver. But I think one of the early ones was in Pasadena, California. And I met a woman who worked there. She was like 19 or 20 years old. And she still had the price sheets. It was like Picasso, $95. And she asked my dad, you know, Mr. Price, what would you buy? And he had a conversation with her and they talked about what she liked, and she bought it. Old in college, she didn't have a safe place to put it. So it lived in her parents' house for quite a while until she, but she bought it on her Sears credit card with a money back guarantee, and she still has it. And it was this transformative thing for her to buy her first work of art.
I was going to say, one of the things I had also read are accounts from artists that talked about how your dad really put them on the map by letting Sears carry their work, but also just buying artwork from them kept them going. It kept them in, continuing to create. And again, that's a wonderful thing.
And he bought what he loved, and he was all about supporting young artists. And some of those artists became famous. Richard Diebenkorn, who's probably the most famous of the West Coast abstract expressionists, and certainly one of the most famous abstract expressionists. My dad bought his first Diebenkorn for, I think, $50. And my mother bought one after that for, I think, I don't know, $75, and, but, Diebenkorn was so grateful to my dad, for his early patronage that he gave my dad one of his pieces. Wow. But what really struck me about it was I owned a couple of art galleries, and a great collector, named Gifford Phillips came in, and he was chatting with me, and he said, I bought my first Diebenkorn because your dad told me to. And I had never really heard it from that side. And that explained something to me as well. First of all, how people valued my dad's eye, but also what a difference it made to those artists. It wasn't just that my dad bought those 2 Diebenkorns. It was that other people bought them because of it. The sweetest story, a story I love, my dad bought this watercolor. I love watercolors. It was an abstract watercolor, and you don't see that many abstract watercolors. They lend themselves better to, let's say, landscape painting. And I fell in love with it. And so my dad bought me one from the same artist for my 16th birthday. It was my 16th birthday present, my own watercolor by that same artist. Well, years and years later, I met that artist. She had moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. I knew she was from Kansas somewhere. And she'd moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she'd become so successful, she'd switched from abstraction into these massive, beautiful landscapes of New Mexico in watercolor that one of the biggest honors for a New Mexico artist is to be picked as the annual poster piece of art for the Santa Fe Opera, which is a world-class opera. And so to be like George O'Keeffe was one of the early Santa Fe artist poster artists, so it's very prestigious. And Joan Foth, that was this woman's name, had been picked. She was doing very, very well. And so I wanted to have lunch with her. So a mutual friend arranged it, and I wanted to tell her, how much I loved her work and how much I loved growing up with that. It was my first real gift, that 16-year-old present. 16 is a big birthday to get that piece of art. But she told me a story I'll never forget. So she was, her work was shown because it was a small town in, I don't know where she was from in Kansas. And my dad always, visited if there was a museum, but her work was often the hotel gift shops were like boutique kind of gift shops in those days. And her work was shown there. And my dad saw it, they always put him up in a nice hotel, and he bought it. Well, his purchase changed her life because apparently 2 months earlier, the most influential banker in town had bought that exact piece of art. And what you have to understand is my dad was so well known as an art expert because he wrote a syndicated column. He'd been on a show called the $64,000 Challenge twice as an art expert. And that was like The Voice or American Idol. It was a huge show that everyone tuned into live. And so everybody knew my dad was this art expert. So this banker bought this piece and brought it home, and his wife hated it. And really? And she was like the hoity-toity society lady. And so it just completely, it was returned to the store, and it just ruined her reputation. And then in walks Vincent Price 2 months later and buys it, and then buys a second one. And she said she never looked back after that. It changed her career and her confidence in herself. So, patronage, I give a lot of talks and I've moderated a lot of groups about the importance of being a collector, a true collector, not somebody who buys art to keep up with the Joneses, but somebody who is a patron of the arts at whatever level you can be a patron of the arts. It's so important because, especially now with no funding for arts in the schools, it's so important that people who understand art and love art and have any kind of financial wherewithal to support the creation of art do.
That's one of the things I'm very sorry about, is that there's no one like your dad to step up to champion the arts like he did. Because like I said,
Steve Martin is a huge collector. Dennis Hopper, who my dad introduced to art, was a big collector. I think there are some, Steve Martin wrote a wonderful piece in, I think it was the New Yorker many, many years ago about why he collects art. So, but I think my dad took the talking about art so seriously. Really, honestly, it was a selfish thing for him. It was the most important thing to him. It was it was like mainlining, joy and hope. And he said, when I lose faith in humanity, I mean, this man lived through, everything, 2 world wars and, the invention of, nuclear weapons. And he said, when I lose faith in humanity, I look at art and I get the faith back. So going around talking about art and making sure that it was kept alive was really sort of his assurance that the world would survive.
Well, Christian had a question, and Christian, I apologize again, but it segues into the next thing I wanted to talk about. Christian wanted to know, what was your dad's favorite book or author?
It's funny. He loved to read, but he really loved poetry the most. So I would say he loved the romantic poets the most. So he loved reading poetry and loved listening to opera. Shelley, Byron, though that's probably what he would turn to read. But the book I remember him telling me how much he loved is an odd book, and it was called, I haven't thought of it in ages. It was, oh my gosh, I can't remember. It was sort of a woman who unravels an art mystery. Oh my gosh, it's gone out of my head. Well, see, I'll have to, it's in my book. You'll have to read my book to find out. But it was a wonderful, what he loved about it. He loved sort of the way that a piece of art can tie history. I know her first name is Josephine Tay, I think was her name. Now I'm gonna have to Google it. Hold on.
Okay.
But it's a book I remember him telling me about, and I'm not saying he thought it was like the greatest book in the history of the world, but it was something that that just really struck him. Can't remember, or maybe it wasn't art. It was history. Josephine Tay, I think, was the daughter of time, but it was this idea that there's so many things that happened in the past that we don't know about, and what he enjoyed was applying that to art. What a piece of art, delving deeply into a piece of art, could tell him about the past.
Gotcha. I'll check it out. Like I said, I've got a copy of your book here. Unfortunately, I've got it packed away with a few other books. I need to dig it out because it's been a few years since I've read it. But again, this segues into what I wanted to ask about. The book that you wrote about your father. What was the inspiration for that? What was it that made you decide to share his story with the world?
Well, I didn't want to write a biography. I had no intention of writing a biography. My brother, who's a writer, a wonderful writer, had been asked to write a biography, and my dad said nobody should have a biography written about them. No, thank you. But a dear friend of mine who knew that my dad was, just really frustrated with the fact that his mind was so sharp, but his body wasn't allowing him to do what he wanted to do anymore, said, "Why don't you two work on a book about art?" And I said, "Oh God, he's never going to say yes to that." And she said, "Why don't you just ask?" So I did. And he I mean, I barely had the words out of my mouth and he said yes. So I had a job then where I worked from, I don't know, 6 a.m. till 1 p.m. So I'd go over to his house in the afternoons and we'd sit on his bed and I'd put the tape recorder between us and we'd talk about art. That's all. We just talked about art. Of course, art leads you all over the place. And so that led us to talking about many other things, but the topic was always art. And then I transcribed all of that. And then I went to New York to really try to sell that book. And he actually passed away, or he started to go when I was in New York. I flew back and he died while I was in the air. But right before I left for New York, he said, I don't know whether I'm going to make it or not. I said, do you not want me to go to New York? He said, no, go sell our book. But then, because he was gone, everybody wanted a biography. And honestly, I don't think kids should write their parents' biography. We're not exactly objective. But I had the benefit of not being born until he was 51. And so he'd had 51 years. And really, let's face it, when do we really become conscious? Really conscious. So most of his career happened while I was, either not on the planet or very young. And so I could approach it historically as well. And the real reason for doing it was that I knew things about what mattered to him, like art and cooking and, the things that if somebody who was just a horror fan wrote it, they could never know. And so it was really, and I had all those transcribed hours of conversation. And we'd worked on another book about art when I first graduated from college. The summer I first graduated from college, it was a series of essays. And so I knew so much. And he was just this great storyteller, and I loved to listen. And Roddy McDowell once said to me, he said, Hollywood doesn't know that it has a history. Yeah. And that is wrong. He said, Hollywood just acts as if it's the next thing is what's important. He said, but Hollywood has a history and somebody has to remember it. And you have had the good fortune of growing up around somebody who knows that history, remembers that history, and wants to tell the story of that history. So you better listen. Yeah. And I always did. I loved listening because my dad was an incredible storyteller. But once Roddy said that, I really understood that I'd been given this gift, this repository of information. And there's people now that I think, I love classic movies, but I wouldn't call myself a classic movie junkie. But, I keep wishing that I was supposed to go out for one of the TCM film festivals, but it was the year of the pandemic, so it was canceled. But I keep hoping they'll invite me because that was what I grew up hearing about. And that was those were the films my mother worked on and my dad worked on. And those are the names I grew up knowing. I barely know who anybody is now, but I know those people. And I'm not even this massive classic movie buff. And so, but I'm a fan of what I studied, what I did my doctoral work on is really about cultural history and the influence of celebrity on our society. And I'm so fascinated with that early celebrity and how it completely molded 20th century America and the world.
Yeah. Well, the wonderful thing about movies and television, there are some that they'll play for a couple of weeks or they run for 13 episodes and they're never seen again. And there are others that become cultural touchstones. There's a line that you can say I can say a line like, may the force be with you. And just about everybody knows that line. Everybody has heard it. And it's a shared experience, I think. It's that thing about I can be 53 years old and talk to a kid who's 13 who's seeing Star Wars for the first time. And it's like seeing it through their eyes again.
Yes.
And that's the wonderful thing about your dad's movies. Again, they're discovering a whole new audience. They're discovering a whole new generation. But the thing about it is, your dad was a lot more than just the movies that he made. I mean, first of all, he was your father. He was a husband. He was a patron to the arts, cook, a friend. And it's wonderful that you were able to preserve that and pass that information along to let people know that he's more than just the man in House of Wax or more than Dr. Fives. And that's,
But the interesting thing is the fans know that, because there was something, when I first sort of was brought into the horror community, I had this little, sort of pang of jealousy. I thought, oh, Sarah's dad, he played this monster, and Bela's dad, he played this monster, and they have these iconic characters associated with them. And my dad, he played Dr. Phibes or Henry Jared. They were monster like, but he's not a Frankenstein or a Wolfman or Dracula. But then I realized that in a funny way, my dad was Vincent Price in everything he did. And I think the reason that his character have really appealed to people is that he played these scary people, and the world is a scary place, to at least if you read the newspapers, it sure looks like it's a scary place, and people experience very, very scary things. But there was this sense that underneath that, there was this smart, funny, kind, cultured, interesting, well-rounded person. And I can't tell you how many people have told me that they would imagine that my dad was their dad or granddad or uncle. And I just warms my heart when they tell me that. But what it taught me too was that my dad was, he never said no to a fan. He would remember people he'd worked with 20 years later. He was a people person in the truest sense of the word. He loved people. And, my stepmother was one of the most famous British actresses in her day. And, she's remembered among her peers, but she was also somebody who was a very challenging person, and she was difficult. And my dad, I'm not saying he was perfect. He would be the last person to say he was perfect. And he certainly could have done better at some things. And, but he loved life. He loved people. He was grateful for the fact that he had a job that he loved. He loved art. He was fortunate in that he got to make a living doing many things that he loved. And he knew how fortunate he was. And he wanted to inspire other people to want to do the things that they love. And what that taught me is that what is remembered, the only thing that anybody remembers is love. And that's the only legacy that anyone can leave that will last. Yes, we all know, who Hitler was, or the horrible Attila the Hun or whatever. But we don't know anything about, there's this interesting series of article now about Hitler's home movies and how it's revising people's idea of who Hitler was. But nobody is sort of rethinking Hitler because of it. They're rethinking the horrors that he did with that information of who he was in these home movies, So the people who have done horrible things almost become sort of caricatures or metaphors, we don't really care necessarily who they were. But the people who have done things, or people who did horrible things to us, we remember sort of the trauma they inflicted. But the people who loved us and the people who went through life exuding love, we remember that. And it's just this object lesson for me every day to try to be more loving. And he wore size 13 shoes, and he wore size 13 shoes in love. So I have big shoes to fill, and it's, I don't succeed at all like he did, but he inspires me every day.
Well, after talking with you for about an hour, I think you're on the right track.
Thank you.
And I will say, your dad, I was lucky. I had parents that were awesome. They were great. But being in the horror community and being a science fiction fan, I have talked to a lot of guys and women too, who weren't so lucky. Their family lives were terrible. They had abusive parents. They had absentee parents. But people like your dad, that was their sanctuary. That's what they went to. And I figure anytime you can leave somebody with a happy memory, when you leave this world and you think to yourself, the world's a little bit sadder and it's a lesser place because this person's gone, that's probably the best legacy I think a person can have.
Well, it's so important, and I feel so grateful that he was my dad, every day. I mean, here I am in my 60s, is it my dream scenario on a purely sort of, human level to be talking? I mean, I do lots of things in my life, but people really want to talk to me about my dad. And, on a just a like on a resume level, let's say, or had you said to me when I was 16, 50 years from now, people are going to still want to talk to you about your dad, more than anything else. I would have been like, oh my God, are you kidding me? But, the fact of the matter is, every single time I'm invited to talk about my dad and I talk about my dad, I feel better at the end of the conversation than I did at the beginning, because I remember who he was. Every time I talk about him, it's like the joy he had in living sort of wells up through me. And I think, okay, thank you. Thank you, Dad. Because that's how I felt when I was with him, when he'd come home from a trip and his face lit up, when I knew how much he loved me, when we did fun things together. And I feel that still talking about him.
That's the way it is with my parents. Both of my parents are gone, but I will talk to family friends or family members that when they share memories about them, it's like they're still here.
And that's the legacy of love.
It is. I've always been a firm believer that love is something that it can't be destroyed. Love is something that gets passed down. The love that I have from my parents was given to them by their parents and given to them by their parents. And as far back as you can trace your line, there's that spark of love that's been going down the line all the way. And hopefully you get to pass it along to your children and you get to pass it along with the people around you.
Exactly. And, one of the reasons I did this tonight was because I have a really dear friend who works with foster kids. And she's told me, so many stories, and the stories that I remember, yes, there are some absolute, as you said earlier, horror stories, but the stories, she says her favorite day of the entire year is adoption day at court. That one day where she gets to go to court and watch the families that she's worked with and help facilitate it, and the kids who get adopted. She said it's just this, it's just pure joy. But also, she tells me these amazing stories of what these foster families, many of them, do for these kids, and it's so profoundly beautiful. And so it's just really important. Here I am fortunate to come from this dad that was so wonderful and so loving. But if your parents have had issues and challenges, there are teachers, there are foster parents, there are adoptive parents, there are, mentors, there are adults out there who can step in and be what your parent couldn't be. And, I've seen that. My parents were away all the time, and my teachers were so important to me. I mean, as perfect and wonderful as my dad was, he was a workaholic, so he was constantly away, but my teachers, they meant the world to me. And, some of them, as I grew older, became dear friends. And, that legacy of love can be passed down from any adult to any kid, and from any adult to each other, and from any kid to each other. It's the most important thing.
Right. And like I said, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to help out this weekend with the charity. Like I said, one simple wish. If you look at the website, these kids are not asking for the world. These are kids that are asking for school clothes. They're asking. One kid was asking for bath hygiene products so he could go to school and go to work. Just simple little things like that. So many things that a lot of people take for granted. And like I said, I was very lucky. All my nightmares came from your dad. All my horrors were made up. But the kids that are out there that this is going to be benefiting, a lot of these kids are stuff that they should have had happier childhoods. So
yes.
Thank you again for joining us. Because like I said, I think your being here and the other celebrities that have joined us tonight and today, it's going to help us reach our goal. So thank you again, Ms. Price. I appreciate it very much. And
Absolutely.
again, it's been a huge honor.
Oh, it's been so lovely chatting with you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's donating. It's so important.
Thank you. Have a good night, guys.
Once again, this is Otherworldly Fundraising. Our fundraising efforts are benefiting one simple wish. Links are located in the description below.